Welcome to week 3 of Pop Culture. As we study the screen life and a story of conflicting worldviews, we're going to look this week at any kind of video and use the critical theory lens in which to look at that. I want to remind you of my contacts. So throughout the semester, you are able to contact me. Feel free if there's any conflict with schedule, so that if you have some sort of a need for an extension or you're not understanding a concept or a reading, to just go ahead and get a hold of me, and I'll spend some time either emailing, I can phone call, or we can text. Let's jump right in. Critical theory. When you think about critical theory in sociology, we often go back to Karl Marx. He, in the time of the Industrial Revolution, was constantly questioning the function of capitalism and the types of people that were perpetuating the development of capitalism during the Industrial Revolution, and taking those everyday life experiences of people creating small amounts of products based on the need of communities, and that being transformed into production from large industries and creating mass amounts of product. For example, tables and chairs. People often would make those themselves or pass them down generation to generation, and it was an artisan's work. Yet, as we see the Industrial Revolution come around, companies hired people to participate in that. So you might be in charge of just making legs for tables for large consumer society. And that was something that Karl Marx had difficulty in supporting and trying to understand where the end point would be for capitalism and the effects it would have on our social structure and the good of all people. So we have to recognize, again, there are many definitions of capitalism, but this comes from a very simple dictionary. I use just the sociology version of Webster's dictionary, and it's a system of wage labor and commodity production for sale, exchange, or profit rather than for immediate need of production. And what this means is this is a way of society that, for example, in North America, we are capitalist typically, and the United States is a capitalist society where we see it as an everyday part of our life to go work for companies and create large mass products and be part of that industry and receive our share. And because we work in that, we get salaries or wages for that. However, we may not be very close to the product. We may just, make a simple piece of that product. And when we look at the movie industry today, I'm not going to talk about all the people that go into that, but there are multiple people that put on that whole entire production. Just watch the end credits of a movie sometime, and you'll get an idea of, compositors and grips and all these different names that we really don't know what they mean, but they help to make that movie experience. And the same is true when it comes to every part of our lives. We think that's organic and just part of what life is about. That's not how a large portion of society operated for a very long time. And there are large places around the world that use different forms of capitalism. There's socialist capitalism. There's also communism, which doesn't basically produce things based on trying to sell things as much as trying to meet need and or kind of have more regulation on things. Then we also see large portions of societies that are hybrids of lots of different systems. So this is the major system, though, and in development theory, something that I'm highly embedded in for my practice. When we study capitalism, we notice that it's one of the core systems that influences the rest of the systems in the world, and that there's a lot of times where we wonder if there's going to be another type of system that comes to take its place, because historically we've seen that happen. And are there hybrids in place right now? That's big theory right now. Let's take it back to looking at the movie industry and in comparison to functionalism. Critical theory tends to focus on the power of the ruling classes, and it is based on things like income status, the things that you learn in your basic sociology class, where there's an embedded system of inequality that marginalizes those people that are not part of that ruling class. So let's look at it this way. Functionalists will see society as functioning, but critical theorists will often say, functioning for who? Does it work for everybody? If somebody is not getting the most out of the system or able to get the resources they need in a system that is said to be functioning, then is it truly functioning? And critical theory will often say also who is represented in the fold that gets to define what is function and who gets to determine what is dysfunction. When we look at the ruling classes, then we have to recognize in a capitalist society that we call that the capitalist class, that the functional society of the capitalist class is enacting powerful forces of definition that represents only their definition of things, or it tends to be reified as the definition that society buys into. Whereas real lives and cultures that are not part of the capitalist class may be overlooked and labeled and seen as counterculture. For example, when I was growing up, punk and rap were often seen as counterculture groups. Yet when you look at the people that were involved, there was often urban youth that were involved that didn't want to conform. They wanted their bodies to be in control of themselves and not be represented in this particular cookie cutter environment, especially was up and against the preppy culture of pop culture at that time. And so it was often seen as subculture if you listened to other genres other than that pop or even hard rock. That's an important exercise to recognize, why are certain cultures that we call subculture being lifted up that way. Same is true of certain types of country. People are seen as a hick if they listen to a particular artist, or they're seen as uneducated. And there are ways in which the capitalist class will try to reify that. Sometimes it's to win elections or try to, be part of getting people to back certain ideas. And that's the next thing that we'll talk about, is that those ideas are reified. And that'll be a little later in the lecture. So let's go back to movies then. When you're looking through the lens at just the movie industry itself, you have to say in critical theory, who owns this? Who gets to run and choose what movies are available to us? You don't see people going out to independent movie festivals very often. You may see some stuff on YouTube or whatever, but for the most part, people pick from what's offered to them. And so the smorgasbord that we get often looks a lot like the ideas of what people want us to see that are owners of the music or of the movie industry, music industry as well. Who writes the screenplay? A lot of times the screenplay writers are the ones that are the conflict of the situation with the producers, the directors, and everyone else. They're seen as a lot of times the creative types, and you'll hear about screenplay writers or writers a lot of times coming together in guilds because they are the ones that are axed first, and it's often because they may want to represent some of those stories that aren't being seen. But the owners and the directors don't see this as making money and profit, and therefore might turn down their ideas. Who casts the actors, and what do the actors look like? Do they represent who you and I look like? Do they represent a global expectation of the world and how we're interacting? Or is it a particular area or culture in the world? Who's represented in the film? Are you there? Are you on that screen? Or do you see yourself in a different light? Sometimes you might say, I like that actor, and you might even try to emulate a lot of that character. But at the same time, is that a real character? When you see it, is it just somebody that's been completely made over to have perfect hair, perfect eyes, perfect body shape, even modified with a lot of the CGI that we have these days? And is that a representation of real life? A lot of times, of course, we know we're going there for a fantasy. But it does say something about our society if we constantly reinvent this fantasy and don't talk about reality. The other thing we have to recognize, as we say for that first question, who are the heads? And I'm not saying of the Hollywood studios, it's the Hollywood stories. Who are these stories? They don't write, they give the okay, yes or no. And so if you look at these four heads of the studios, this is Jeff Shell here, part of Universal, Jim Giannopoulos, who is at Paramount, Bob Iger, who is at Disney, and Tom Rothman, who is at Sony. they have a lot of power over some parts of our world. They, produced Jurassic World, Star Trek, Frozen, all of these movies that we will go see or have seen that have been embedded in our life. And for the most part of the Hollywood industry's lifespan, it has looked a lot like this: white male men that were in power. Now, we have seen some changes in the last 10 years, and Warner Brothers has a person of Asian background as an Asian American in the lead, and then 20th Century Fox has Stacey Schneider, who is the only female, and she's in charge of certain films like X-Men, and so you may see a little bit more representation of feminist character in her way of looking at things, but it's not always guaranteed. Just because she's female may not still be the way that she looks at the lens, because capitalists often look at what will sell. And then so this is a lot of what the industry would look like. Lionsgate, which is a smaller group, still had a lot to do with Harry Potter and that whole world. And so we see representation somewhat, but again, there's a particular look that the capitalist class will provide, and they're in charge of the yay or nay of our stories. And again, as I mentioned earlier, screenplay writers a lot of times are given adaptions, for example, of books that maybe we bought or listened to, the Harry Potter series, the ideas of, some crime stories. However, the characters may be changed based on the director and based on the producer and based on the company. And so a lot of times we see screenplay writers given the charge that they may write a screenplay about a book around a particular actor that's been cast and also been chosen by the director that absolutely does not look like the characters in the books that the screenplay is being adapted to. And so we see this issue of what we call whitewashing. For example, Ben Affleck played in Argo a Mexican-American, Hispanic-American reporter. And here is this person who is Caucasian, and they give him a little more tanning cream, but why didn't we have a Hispanic actor? And a lot of times the brand of Ben Affleck has been superimposed over the actual story itself. The other's case might be Angelina Jolie in A Mighty Heart. She played a mixed race woman, and she's Caucasian. Again, why did we not have an actor that was mixed race playing that role? And critical theorists would bring this to the forefront. By the way, critical theory often has sub-theories like feminism, understanding race theory, or LGBTQAI theory, any representation of the minority group. And so we can talk more about that, and you can use that if you would like in your final project, maybe as a subcategory of the critical theory, which embeds those questions. Karl Marx then would say the ideas of the ruling class are really what we get sold. They are in every epic the ruling ideas. So the idea of the movie line, think about the storylines, think about what you're seeing, the representation of the actors. You can almost tell what's going to happen with almost every film. It's very rare that you can, be blown away by an ending, and it can happen, but we typically are seeing a large portion of the same story over and again, the same types of actors, body types, and cultural representations of what a majority of the society would say this is what our ideals are. We're looking forward to that based on that being told to us or being the only choice that we're given. The class, which is the ruling material force of society, therefore, these are the producers of our movies and TV shows. I haven't brought that into the play. We don't have a lot of time. I don't want to have a 2-hour lecture today, but it's the same concept. Who's picking the screen play? Who's doing the writing for the TV shows? Those people in charge of that material force of society are the same time, they're in charge of our intellectual ideas. They are those who hold the intellectual force. And that's what Marx and others that are part of the critical theory would uplift, is that we are only given a certain amount of imagination to work with because these are the places that we are able to, that are at access for us. So even when we recognize that minority groups, and in many cases what I call reality groups, are represented, how they're represented is also important. And so these are some movies that might represent African Americans and women in some cases. It depends on the movie. And so the way Straight Out of Compton talks about the story and how this uh, shares the idea of the birth of a particular group and their rap and their understanding of what's going on in Compton versus identifying with the story of slavery and those who were free slaves that were captured in 12 Years a Slave. We see a story of a particular person, highly intelligent. There is this experience and hidden figures of both females, and there you also see the figure a little bit fuller of a woman, but you do see all three of these women lined up, but they're also looking a little lighter skinned a little bit. Are they that light skinned in life? Or has there been some whitewashing in some ways there? Here in Get Out, we definitely see a darker skinned person, but we also see in Moonlight, I think, one of the best representations of a real raw story that's really trying to represent a story that's happening. The other part of critical theory in this day and age is that we have a larger role in it because we're a global society that's connected through video and through our internet. And the production of the movie industry is often challenged. And one way that's challenged is through another video phenomenon, YouTube. For example, it used to be that the industry would just produce these movies and this is where you go. But, a lot of times there's money spent on major movies that are total bombs. And we don't necessarily buy into it as much. And people would just end up going to those movies and they'd maybe learn through the newspapers or whatever about that, but it was a lot slower production of information. These days, you can go onto Twitter, you can go onto Facebook, you can go onto different places like that where people are like, don't go to this movie. But then YouTube is a place where a lot of times there are critics that will give you their whole, they do this with Game of Thrones, they do this with anything that's going on in that genre of video and movie industry and TV industry. And that is giving us a little bit more voice where it challenges the movie industry because you have a critical eye and there are people out there you may listen to. And we pay attention to YouTube influencers. Now, this is the top 10 YouTube influencers based on January 2019. That I don't even know, a large portion of these people. Maybe you do. 5-minute crafts I've seen a lot of, but there are times where if you have this many, look at this, 36.8 million subscribers with Ed Sheeran. He's seen as kind of an everyday guy, very talented. He's Irish, and there's this sense of, or London, no, people that are, I don't think he's Irish, I think he's from England. But there's this sense of him having a voice here, and there may be ways in which he's being channeled by folks that are in control of his brand. But this is more and more, we're seeing people being able to challenge some of the areas that we don't see a typical person represented because they go on and they follow other subscriptions of people and hear their voice. So therefore, we become active agents of critique in venues that the ruling classes can't control as much because they can't influence that space as much. They may be able to go into some of those YouTubers, and I'm sure many of them have sponsors that they have to pay attention to. But at their beginning, they probably had more of a free reign to be able to critique the world. And so the common person can influence the ruling classes based on the videos such as what's on YouTube or what we see on our internet. And so I often say this is part of critical theory that's going on every day. And it reminds us then of our own considerations of what our favorite movies, video, YouTube, all of that we're doing, for us to go back into our brain and say, okay, then how am I using everything with my purchase? How does my purchase play a part in creating popular culture and also how is popular culture and what's considered popular, the functional popular, challenged by my ability to have lots of places in which to go consider whether I'd go to a movie or not, or watch that TV show or not. Is it influenced by what's popular, how many stars it gets, or Rotten Tomatoes? Do you see these signs right here and go, okay, it's got this nice fresh tomato, so it's certified fresh, I'm going in, or it's got this splatty green tomato and I'm not even going to consider going to that. I may watch it on Netflix. That's a constant thing that we have had at our feet for a while. And so that's important for us to recognize. And that challenges what in Gracie, and he highlights two critical theorists, Theodore Adorno and Max Horkheimer, who basically say, you don't often want to be fed things that look exactly alike by a culture that's in power of that, meaning, and those are the technical terms, homogeneity, which is that sense of alikeness, the same movie line, the same actors, the same stuff that we see on TV, given to us by a power that just we have no control over. And so what they saw, these two were writing in the 90s, and they saw the hegemonic power of lots of spaces, not just movie industry, basically putting the same stamp on everything. And this is how they defined it. Culture now impresses the same stamp on everything. Films, radio, magazines, which, by the way, radio and magazines we don't listen to as much. But you could say the same as films, TV, Netflix, playlists, make up a system which is uniform as a whole and in every part. Again, they're not representing some that may not look like that uniformity. Under monopoly capitalism, all mass culture is identical and the lines of its artificial framework begin to show through. And that's where your critical voice as a critical theorist might say, I am not represented in that. My body isn't represented in that. Why should I give my money to that? And maybe even why should I support a system that's what we culturally reify? To give you the simple terms of that large quote, which would be a good one to consider for interacting with your final project, homogeneous just means identical, uniform, alike. It's the same thing over and over again. Hegemony is that leadership of dominance, especially by one country or social group over others, to where you just see that larger industry. For example, Hollywood industry. There's lots of movie industries. For example, India produces an amazing amount of films, and they're fun and amazing, but they also have a large portion of homogeneous understanding a lot of the time. But we have to recognize, certain industries have complete dominance, and the U.S. with the types of Oscars and those types of things that people are looking for is being challenged. Who gets to determine who gets an Oscar and who doesn't? And then that leads us to monopoly capitalism, which is the capitalist system that's not just about making money and profit, but it's also about cornering those markets with monopolies, which we often see with our studios. So the question this week, and I've got a couple more definitions before we conclude today, but the question for you this week, are you represented in the characters of the screen, movies, television, YouTube, whatever you see? If we don't see ourselves, and this is part of also Grazian's definition when he talks about stunts imagination, if we don't see ourselves, it stunts imagination. We can't imagine another world unless they have imagined it for us. We get used to it, and we start to place ourselves in these characters. And that's one of the reasons I had you pick a superhero. Some of you didn't have superheroes because that wasn't representative of who you were. But it's a great question for us to consider. What would we imagine if we didn't have everybody telling us, these stories? Or maybe the other way around is there's a function of story to help us identify who we are. We can get to major philosophy with that, but it is important to consider that you might have an imaginative self that is not being represented well. And that would be seen as a form of social control, meaning you would get used to that, and maybe you think you'd like that, and that's fine. I mean, it's not one decision over another, but a critical theorist would say, you've been regulated and sanctioned to a certain point, and given a certain amount of social control, and often this is used, we're talking about sanctioning society for crime or for any kind of, in criminology we use this a lot, but the same is true when we look at the industries that produce the material that we base our identity on, including movies, stories, storylines, and who are the people that represent us on the screen. It even shows through in the way we see and watch. Now, this is my one TV piece today. The Super Bowl is something you watch, possibly. But on the Super Bowl Sunday, you expect certain types of commercials. Tell me what they are. Beer, chips, maybe a life insurance of some sort that is making fun of something like Geico or car insurance. They all have images that typically have something to do with party atmosphere. Often you'll see women, food, any kind of food like Hardee's was really big. It's regulated to refine the audience. What Super Bowl football, that identity of maleness, what it looks like, but also sportsness, that whole world creating the setting of the rules. So if you see a tampon commercial on the Super Bowl, you would think that is not regulation. That needs to be sanctioned. I think it would be fine. But there's a lot of times where that's not the market. And so therefore we see ourselves expecting certain things. Budweiser's got to show up. We've got to have Doritos or whatever kind of Doritos we can eat. And there's a certain reifying. And the critical theorist would look at that and say, why is that? What kind of culture? And then finally, planned obsolescence. Planned obsolescence means it's going to be in a capitalist structure. Anything that's new and popular is meant to be obsolete eventually. So many of you, when you talked about your favorite music, you're like, I am not part of the popular culture because I love stuff from the 70s. I love stuff from the 60s. I'm into Frank Sinatra. The thing is, they were part of the popular culture at one time, but you were part of something that, even though it's not popular now, it was part of that system of popularity where the must-have, must-watch is often something that is sent into obsolescence. It's obsolete in order to start the cycle of capitalism over again. We'll talk more about that with fashion. We're in a major cycle right now that's really destructive. And so that consumer cycle is something that's expected of the current world system. And again, going back to Marx, he would criticize that, saying that everything he said about capitalism actually happened. That we have very cheap products, but we also have a large portion of our imagination and our self-agency taken away from us because our sense of self is controlled by ruling classes. So what can be said about critical theory in terms of video? First, keep aware of the ruling class power. Second, recognize social inequalities, such things like whitewashing or understanding that not everybody might be represented or represented even truthfully. Critique of the homogenous and the hegemonic, meaning things that look exactly alike that you're being fed and constantly go spend money on. And even though it may bring you joy, I'm not trying to criticize that or criticize you, but to recognize that that might be something you've bought into as normal. Why do we do that? Hegemonic, who has the power? What are the powers that be? And why does a small group of people get to make larger decisions for a larger group of people? The role of capitalism, especially monopolies, in being able to reify the system of money making and therefore the disparities that might come out of that. The media used as forms of social control and trying to keep us intact. And then finally, that we expect in this type of a system with a critical eye to see that things will be obsolete and that that's an expected norm. However, and I will say this every single time as we move into the next theory, are we only influenced by the ruling classes? Do you have a mind that maybe says, no, I'm not really? That's a good question to ask. Do we draw meaning from life, from various experiences of symbol or culture or language? And maybe we do have a sense of being woke or understanding certain things in our lives that have that critical eye all the time, and so we're not as dumb as what most people think we are. And then finally, how much do we express our tastes outwardly in contrast to our inward selves, which may paint another picture of who we are. And that then brings us to what we often will call interactional theory, where our interactions with each other may counter a lot of what Marx had said. Maybe it's all in intersection in its own sense. But next week, we'll look at interaction theory and we'll look at fashion. And remember this week to post, respond, have fun. Again, I'm reachable here. Have a great week.